9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Hello and welcome to Scylla Consciousness again this week, where we are going to discuss, as we do every week, issues that pertain to AI and in particular AI and policy. Very pleased to let you know that although we're one of the newer podcasts out there about AI, we've entered the ranks of the top 10 podcasts that there are anywhere on AI, and we're the number one podcast on AI and public policy, and we're proud of that, and thank you for your support. One of the reasons we are is that we have had great guests in the past, and one of those great guests has returned to us this week, and I'm extremely happy for that, and I know you will be too. Dr. Alondra Nelson is the Harold F. Linder Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study and a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. She previously served as Deputy Assistant to President Joe Biden and Acting Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And apropos of our discussion today, she is now a member of the UN Advisory Body on Artificial Intelligence. Welcome, Alondra.
Great to be back with you, David, and congratulations on your success.
Well, it's. I think it's a reflection of having people like you here to talk about it, and I think it's a big reflection on the number of people who want to talk about these issues. Now, I've looked at this UN report that you participated in, which. I guess the official title is Governing AI for Humanity. And since it is UN General Assembly Week, I thought it would be a good time to talk about it. What do you think? I mean, I know there are a list of principal recommendations and so forth, but from participating in the process, and I know there were a lot of people who participated in the process, what's your big takeaway?
So I guess my big takeaway is that although we've got all sorts of geopolitical competition, contestation, hot wars, cold wars going on, that there are sometimes a few things about which, countries can agree upon. And, I like to see the report that came out a week ago Thursday as a sort of slow layering of a kind of growing, if imperfect, international consensus around AI governance. So I think the big takeaway for me is that, and that you want to put it in a broader kind of spectrum, which includes, in March of last year, the U.S. advancing, a proposal to the whole General Assembly that said that, global AI governance should abide the UN Charter and should abide international human rights law. And that was approved by all 193 member states. And so even as there's fractures and fragmentation, I think all across the UN ecosystem and obviously the world, to be able to get 193 member states to agree on anything is significant. And I want to understand this report as part of, I think, that broader conversation and a recognition that AI as a policy issue, as an economic issue, as a tool for, social change is so urgent and so important that even, enemies want to be at the table together to have a conversation about it.
Okay, well, let me pick up on that point. There's obviously a lot to talk about in it, but I was having a conversation with a senior official of a big country whose responsibility is national security, and that individual was old enough to remember the NPT, and said that's what he's worried about. That he is worried that what's going to happen is the U.S. and China are going to get into a kind of rivalry over AI, that they'll come up with some international agreements, and that those agreements will, as in the case of nuclear weapons, lock everybody else out. Now, of course, this is different from nuclear weapons in countless ways, not the least of which is that, of course, AI can be a force for good. But I think there is a sense in the world, and there is a sort of a theme that runs throughout the report, that there are already haves and have-nots, and there is a growing AI digital divide. And it seems to be one of the things that the report acknowledges, but I'm not sure that we've taken a big step towards solving the problem.
Right. So I think, I would put a finer point on what this colleague said to you and say there is indeed intense competition between the United States and China around AI. Like it's not might happen, we're living in the midst of it right now. And, so I think all the more important, that we try to have these conversations. I mean, I think, the non-proliferation treaty was, you know, complicated, has not been a total success, but we have not yet destroyed ourselves with nuclear war. It's also, I would just also note as a sidebar that, that some of the concerns around high capability AI are about its ability to really, expand the power and scale of things like nuclear weapons. So there's a cross cut here, I think, of the NPT and AI governance. I think that's worth just noting. So we're not going to solve it. And I think, the competition is geopolitical. It's also commercial. So we've got, big stakes with lots of money here. We've also got a time in which it's still a relatively new technology, and the country or the company or the countries and companies that can create the norms and the standards around these new technologies can win not just in the geopolitical sphere, but also in the commercial sphere. So I don't think it's going away, but I think, David, is the alternative to not to try to do anything at all. And I think that's not, a reasonable alternative. And I think, if we think back to the Cold War, the UN and other kinds of multilateral bodies, but, 1.5 track meetings and the like, were places where there was still some ability to keep a little bit of conversation going, even as lots of other things were paralyzed by competition. And so, I think the sort of mission of the UN and the founding of the UN and the earlier in the 20th century, part of its mission, I think, is to try to keep open windows to the extent that you can have them, even if they're, they're only a crack of an open window, even when nation states have kind of high walls around the rest of what they're doing.
Well, I'll come back to that. I would like to come back to the gaps and things, but just because we also like to stick to the news of the week. Speaking of high walls, or as people like to refer to it these days, high fences around small yards, the Biden administration kicked off the week with some new restrictions on the Chinese that had to do with things like software in cars. And that they're concerned about the ability of that software to collect data that could be significant, useful to the Chinese. But there's a problem here at the heart of this, and that is when you combine the Internet of Things with AI, everything everywhere is collecting data all the time for everyone. And it these small yards and high fences make sense, but it seems to me it's like trying to drain the ocean with a spoon. It may not actually be an achievable goal, and I'm interested in what your thoughts are.
I think this is an instance in which we also took too long, right, to create norms and standards. So I recall being on a committee, I think that was led by the World Economic Forum a decade ago, that was on the challenges of the Internet of Things. So it's not like a new problem, but I think it's a problem we've been slow to address in the policy space. And, the challenge, of course, David, is not just the data flowing everywhere, but data has a political economy. It's a market, and it's a market in which there's a lot of U.S. companies who are part of the sort of data brokering and data exchange. And so I think that made it a little more difficult to sort of see, for some, the risk landscape when it's a booming industry, and in the U.S. context. And so I think that I think we don't want to live in a world of surveillance cars. I think whether or not the data is going to U.S. companies, which there's been some reporting on that as well a couple of weeks ago, or potentially to China, the implications that are different. Obviously, the stakes are a little bit different. But I do think that it is not for naught that we have had in both congressional sessions this year and last year an attempt to advance in the US some kind of data privacy. And both times they sort of fell apart at the end. But there is a growing awareness that, you know, what have people said? Data is the new oil. It is certainly a currency. There's certainly a political economy about it. And I think the Biden-Harris administration's actions this week also suggest that we know that it has tremendous geopolitical stakes. And you know, if I would just to go to the UN a report that I was a part of, I mean, one of the recommendations that I think is going to be the most challenging is this ongoing pursuit in the United Nations to do something around data sharing and about creating norms around data. You know, that's, I think, recommendation number 6 of 7 or 5 of 7. And to me, that's among the most difficult of them because you have nation states that have member states that have very different sort of agendas for data. You have some communities that are saying, we don't even have our data. We're trying to figure out how to bring it all together. You have others who have large caches of data and are trying to use it to leverage, you know, applications of AI and the like. And so there's a lot of, I think, conflicting incentives around data that is in the UN report as well.
You know, I really enjoy talking to you, but you're kind of a nightmare from a moderating perspective because every time you say something, I then get 5 more questions, and then they would lead me in 5 different directions, which is a good thing.
You have to
But
help me back then.
yeah, well, that's what I try to do. But it just, I sometimes these little cul-de-sacs are interesting, and we spend a lot of time talking about data and foreign powers, but you know. Listening to you, one of the things that strikes me is this can be an issue domestically as well. We have a presidential candidate right now who's running who says, I'm going to round up 10 to 20 million Americans and I'm going to deport them. Now, quite apart from the impossibility of the task and the odiousness of the task, the only way to do that task is to use the resources of the United States government to identify those people. And particularly a president who has immunity might well say, well, I'm just going to go and grab the data from their cars. I'm going to grab the data from their, you know, whatever, you know, bank cards and this could be a tool of repression domestically, quite apart from the national security elements, right?
Sure. I think I don't know what the whole sort of spectrum of possibilities might be for a second Trump administration to execute this plan to round people up and deport them at scale. But we already know that we can use things like, domestically, like, driver's license readers, right? You know, like in gated communities already, some of the ways that you can get into a gated community in Arizona or Florida, for example, is to, you know, somebody or something, some kind of AI system is reading your license plate. And so there's that. There's facial recognition technology, which we don't have either. You know, we don't have domestic policy around. And of course, is being used for national security purposes, likely being used for homeland security purposes as well. I think the challenge of this AI moment, in part, is that things that we had been worried about on the domestic front, I think the scale at which you can do them, the ease at which you can do them, everything from any kind of computer vision, so that would be the license plates or facial recognition technology, to being able to quickly aggregate data about people and sort of geolocate them. It's a world that we've been, I think, living in or creeping into for a long time. But I think because AI is such an important policy issue and issue in public space right now, that we're becoming increasingly aware of it.
Yeah, the other cul-de-sac I'll go down for 30 seconds before coming back to this thing is on the issue of data as having economic value, data as the new oil. Because one of the things that strikes me is that we are still, even though we're well into the, quote, big data era, or, these other areas that we've discussed, at a point where, your neighborhood CPA does not know how to assess the data on your balance sheet. And yet data is the asset in many cases, and countries have data assets, companies have data assets. And it strikes me that every company in the world is undervalued because nobody actually knows what the value of the data asset is.
I think that's right. And I think, one of the things I've seen in conversations with people in industry, not sort of tech industry, but people who are trying in the corporate world to make sense of, how they should be thinking about AI is, where is our data? How do we use it in the company? How do you even think strategically about what kinds of flows of information or commerce flows are data, that can be meaningful in a way that you can leverage for greater information in the organization. We hope not surveillance of employees, for example, but to and also to sort of think about, can I build a foundation model with them, for example. I think if I'm recalling correctly, I know that Bloomberg, which is an organization that's pretty good on data, more than most, attempted to make a foundation model and found that using its own proprietary in-house data, and found that they didn't even really have enough data to be able to do it at scale, to create a really reliable model. So, data is, it's an asset, may well be, the new oil, but the scale at which you need to have it and the computational power around it, I think, is growing quite quickly. That also, I think, makes data conversations and claims about things like data sovereignty and data privacy, more challenging.
Yeah, so that brings us back to the report. And one of the core elements of the report has to do with this sort of growing digital divide or fear of the digital divide. And within the report, I noticed what I might call a governance divide. I think there's a chart in the report that sort of says, here are the governance models that exist, and here are the number of countries that are involved. And in every case, there are 20 or 30 countries that are involved, and there are 100 and X number of countries that are just not involved. And that is a divide that is compounded by what you were just talking about. Chips cost a lot, energy costs a lot, cooling costs a lot. It requires a lot of brain power, and there are a bunch of different angles at this. One of the ones that the report addresses is capacity building. Another one has to do with funding. Create a fund. Get money out. And when I talk to people in emerging markets, they start with the funds. They're like, how do we pay for this? And it seems to me that not only is that a challenge for them, but, if you're going to go and build a big fence or a high fence in a small yard, or you're going to be in a competition, the comparative advantages of one system or another, one country or another, are going to be heavily influenced by the degree to which they're willing to finance getting their systems into different countries, right? You can imagine a kind of a financing war.
Correct.
Where Huawei goes up to Ghana and says, here, take our system. We'll finance it this way. And Google goes up and says, we'll do it a different way. And their relative countries have an interest in that. How do we tackle that? Or is that even possible to tackle that?
A couple of things I would say. One, around the framing of the sort of haves and have-nots in the report, because I didn't entirely agree with this, but this is the report was by consensus. It wasn't unanimous. And, the report, I do think there's a global governance sort of gap, and I think the report tries to offer some recommendations of what we might do. But I also think it gives, by identifying a few kind of bilateral or regional initiatives, short shrift to lots of other work that's happening in the AI governance space around the world. So, the African Union recently released an AI strategy. I've spent some time with AI policymakers in Singapore over the last year on several occasions. They're doing very sophisticated work. So I kind of, I feel like the framing is more, I think, polar than I think is actually true on the ground. And I think that's worth saying. With regard, I mean, we have learnings, as they say in the in the consultancy world. We have learnings from Huawei. I mean, from the politics around that, which is to say, either you build the infrastructure or you don't build the infrastructure. And to your point, if you get to build the infrastructure, then you get to build the world, and you set the terms of engagement. So I think partly what you see right now is an attempt for the U.S. to really lead in this space. And I was at as part of the high level UN week. I attended Secretary Blinken's speech in which he announced, I think, $100 million in investment from the U.S. federal government to a kind of global inclusivity fund. Google, James Manico was there and announced $120 million that they're putting towards the fund, and you had a lot of other big tech companies besides. So my takeaway from that is that the U.S. does feel a profound sense of responsibility around not only creating norms that are advantageous to the U.S. and standards, but also to making sure that there's more inclusion in these processes. So this is really early days, and there's a long way to go. But I think there's something, this is not the fund that precisely that I think is called for in the UN report. But I think if you added up all of the sort of money and effort that was announced 2 days ago in New York City at this event with Secretary Blinken, you probably have something in the ballpark of $1 billion, which is not nothing, and public commitments that this would be, funds that would, help folks in the global majority in the global South. So, I think the U.S. has been. We also have, kind of related to Huawei, the lesson of China's ambition around its One Belt, One Road initiative, which was a lot of infrastructure building. Some of it was digital infrastructure. And the U.S. was not participating, I think, in the same way. And so we might also think about Secretary Blinken's announcement and this new public-private partnership as being a U.S. response to wanting to really be in the vanguard in the leadership role of building out infrastructure. The other thing I would add, David, which I hope won't bring us too much on a cul-de-sac, that's been fascinating, and I think was also announced this week by the White House, are these new investments and partnerships with the UAE. So we're building kind of, committing to building these big data centers that will, allow potentially very more capable than now AI models to be developed, at a kind of more expansive and larger scale. And so, that's an infrastructure relationship, but that's also a deepening of a geopolitical relationship that, sort of bears watching.
Yeah, it certainly does. I just want to say parenthetically to our listeners, although if you listen each week, that this podcast, Scylla Consciousness, is underwritten in part by a grant from the Embassy of the UAE. And they don't have an involvement in our editorial content. And I didn't bring up the UAE. And I want to make sure that it's very clear to everybody that we let people talk about what they want. That was the original concept when they underwrote this thing. I think it is a significant development, but I've just made it a rule not to comment on things that have to do with the UAE in order to ensure that we are seen as editorially independent, which I hope we are. But it does get to the nubbin of this problem, because $1 billion doesn't get you very far. It doesn't really get you data centers, much less hundreds of them, much less power sources, much less edge infrastructure, much less training programs for government officials to, get them up to speed, et cetera, et cetera. What we're talking about is trillions of dollars.
Sure.
And, one could easily see this devolve, as I said at the outset, into a kind of AI Cold War. And that's kind of the worst possible case scenario. When you were in these groups, was that a topic of conversation?
The groups, you wouldn't be surprised. I mean, as the UN is the sort of seat of diplomacy, the conversations were actually quite diplomatic, and we weren't representing nation states. We were all there in our personal capacity, although there were several people from China and a colleague from Russia, and a few of us from the United States. So the conversations were actually, I think, quite mild, so shockingly mild, given that given the sort of broader context we were in. I think if I had to, gloss sort of distinctions, certainly colleagues from the global south are quite concerned about being engaged and involved and not having, the sort of AI age happen to them and happen without their participation and involvement in some regard. And so that, manifest in requests for capacity building, whether or not that's sort of infrastructure or helping people with skill training and these sorts of things. Um, and I think colleagues from China were, the Chinese also put forward in, I think, July of this year to the General Assembly their own sort of proposal about how, AI should be, governed. And a lot of that was around, capacity building and sort of sharing the sort of spoils of that AI might bring. And so you saw so that was also passed by 193 member states, including the United States. And you certainly saw some of that emphasis in the small room conversations that we had as a group of 38 people from, I think, 33 countries.
Well, it is a kind of sweeping report for people who are interested in AI. It's very useful to look at. I think it's particularly useful to look at in the context of all the national things you've seen come out on this, and they tend to be kind of soft, but leaning in a direction, and certainly more cooperation, more understanding, raising of awareness, building capacity are all important things. But I bet that you came out of it thinking, now we got to do this next. That there is some, follow up here that
Yeah.
you hope will be prioritized. That wasn't a focus there. And in our last couple of minutes, I'd like you to focus on that, if you would. What do groups like this UN cooperative process, which, by the way, for those who haven't read it, it calls for ongoing consultations around UN meetings and scientific advisory boards, and so essentially, it's kind of getting the ball rolling.
Yeah.
Where do you want it to see it go personally?
Well, I hope that, I've been particularly as a researcher, particularly interested in this international panel that some are calling shorthand a kind of IPCC, international intergovernmental panel on climate change, for AI. So how do we think does that work for AI? In part because I think what all states face is a challenge over how you create governance when the information base, like, what is the state of the science around AI is sort of quickly moving or uncertain. And so I think if there can be some, even marginal agreement on that, and the proposal here is not to release a report like the IPCC every several years, but to do one annually as well as thematic reports quarterly. So to be much more, much quicker. So I think I'm encouraged by that. One of the things the report says, but not as a formal recommendation, is for, a way we'd put it in Americanism, is like for the UN to get its own house in order, which is to say, there's a lot of, I think, competing and cross-cutting projects in the UN itself that are about digital this and digital that and technological this and, tech standards that. And, is there a way that those things can be better coordinated and do their work, I think, better? So I'm encouraged by that as well. And I do think that being able just to, I think, have all of these summits, AI summits, meetings, and the like, the Department of Commerce announced a new one of network of AI safety institutes that's going to meet in San Francisco in the third week of November. How do we think about those across the spectrum as they're happening increasingly? And can the UN play a role and sort of raising up the level of kind of information sharing across that? So there's lots to do. And I think those are some of the things that could be done immediately.
And are you going to keep doing it with these guys?
We'll see. We'll see. I mean, I was nominated by the Biden-Harris administration to do this in my personal capacity. I'm certainly committed to, I think, trying to stand up. I'm already a part of something that came out of the first AI Safety Summit, which happened at Bletchley Park in the UK in the fall of 2023. And that's called an International Scientific Report on Advanced AI Safety. So that interim report came out at the Seoul Summit, and a final report, I think, will come out in November for the San Francisco meeting. So I serve as an advisor to that. And so I think doing that at a bigger scale, not only about AI safety, but about AI capabilities and just the range of what we know about the science, would be an outgrowth of something I'm already doing. So that might be a way where I can help.
Super interesting. As always, great conversation. I'm so grateful that you could spend this time with us and give us an insight into this important report during the week of the UN General Assembly meeting. So thank you, Alondra. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll be back with more of this each and every week. We hope you will join us and tell your friends to join us. And that's it, though, for now from Still Consciousness. Bye-bye.